Welcome to a deep dive. This one is into the life of Harriet Tubman.
Oh wow, what a figure in American history.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at this podcast interview I found with a park ranger. She's an expert on Tubman, but she also has like a really cool personal connection to Tubman's story. And she's actually like walked some of the same landscapes and even tried out some of the survival skills that Tubman would have used.
Oh wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
That kind of like firsthand experience can really bring history to life, you know? It's one thing to read about it in a book, but to actually like feel the terrain under your feet, to sense the isolation and challenges of that environment, I think that adds a whole new dimension to understanding her story.
totally. So our goal in this deep dive is to like uncover the real Harriet Tubman, to go beyond just the like iconic image and really get into like all the details of her life. And the ranger starts by describing pre-Civil War Maryland's Eastern Shore, which is where Tubman was born. And she describes it as like this serene but really stark landscape, very swampy and flat and remote and unforgiving.
Yeah, and that landscape was so crucial in shaping Tubman. That's where she learned all the skills of being an outdoors woman, navigating by the stars, foraging for food, moving quietly through difficult terrain.
Yeah.
Like these weren't just hobbies, they were like survival mechanisms. That later became so essential to her work on the Underground Railroad.
Right. It's so cool how those like ordinary parts of where she grew up became such important tools later on.
Hmm.
The ranger also talks about Tubman's early life, and obviously it was like steeped in the harsh realities of slavery.
Mm.
We hear about her being born into slavery, witnessing her sisters being sold, and just enduring like backbreaking labor from when she was a child.
Yeah, and it's important to understand the context of slavery in Maryland at the time. It wasn't like that big plantation system that we see in like Gone with the Wind or something. Maryland had smaller farms, and so the enslaved people were in closer proximity to their enslavers. And there was also like a significant free black population. So that created this really complex psychological environment where the difference between freedom and enslavement was like always right there in front of you. Can you imagine the impact that had on young Tubman, seeing that contrast every day?
It's hard to even imagine. And then, of course, we come to Tubman's escape to freedom. The ranger actually shares an actual runaway notice from the time the Tupi describes Tubman. It says chestnut color, fine looking, and about 5 foot tall.
It's chilling to hear those words, knowing the dehumanizing system that they represent.
It's a reminder of how enslaved people were seen as like property,
Yeah.
just commodities. But it also shows us Tubman's courage. She wasn't just running from something, she was running towards something.
Mm.
Freedom. Yeah, she actually describes reaching freedom in her own words. She said, when I found I'd crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything, and the sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields.
Wow, that quote is really powerful. It really gets to the heart of what freedom means. It's about becoming human again and seeing the world in a new way.
It's incredible. But Tubman didn't just stop at her own freedom. She risked her life over and over again to go back and help others escape. And that's where the Underground Railroad comes in.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that the Underground Railroad wasn't some sort of like literal train system. It was a network of safe houses and secret routes and coded messages, all dependent on the bravery of people willing to help. It was incredibly dangerous, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. That made helping runaway slaves illegal everywhere in the country.
Yeah, that's an important point for listeners who might not know. The Fugitive Slave Act basically said that even if an enslaved person got to a free state, they could still be captured and returned to slavery. So it was like the whole country became a hunting ground.
Exactly. And that just made the risks for the Underground Railroad even higher.
Especially for someone like Tubman, who was going back into slave territory.
Exactly.
The ranger also talks about Tubman's use of codes and secret communication. There's this one story about a song that Tubman sang to her family as she was escaping. It sounded like she was saying goodbye, but it was actually filled with hidden messages of hope and a promise that she would return. I love that detail.
Yeah, me too. It shows how creative and resilient people had to be.
It really does. And then there's that story about Tubman using the call of a hoot owl to signal she was there. I really want to know more about how that worked.
Yeah, how did that work?
Was she like literally hooting like an owl in the woods? And like, did everyone just know what that meant?
Well, the ranger gives us some clues. So hoot owls were common in the area, so the call wouldn't be suspicious. It's likely that Tubman used it as like a general signal to say she was nearby, And then they would have prearranged meeting places, maybe with other secret signals to actually meet up.
Oh, so it wasn't just a random owl call in the night.
Right, it was part of a bigger plan.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and then get this. The ranger said that Tubman would use cemeteries as meeting places.
Cemeteries. That's kind of creepy, but also brilliant.
Right, think about it. It was a place where black people could gather without raising suspicion. People would assume they were mourning, not planning an escape.
Wow, Tubman was thinking 10 steps ahead.
Yeah, she was.
But those journeys must have been terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
The ranger actually tried walking through those same landscapes at night in the winter without a flashlight to get a sense of what it was like. And she said it was a really humbling experience.
Wow, even without the fear of being caught, that must have been tough.
It really shows you what those escapes were really like.
It does. And then, of course, there's Tubman's work during the Civil War, which is like a whole other chapter of incredible things. The ranger talks about how she went from leading people on the Underground Railroad to actually working for the Union Army as a nurse, a cook, a spy, and a scout.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in school. It's easy to forget how all those skills she learned on the Underground Railroad, like gathering information, moving around quietly, being a leader, those were perfect for the war.
They really were, and those skills were put to the test in a really amazing event. The Combahee River Raid, this is where Tubman really steps into a military role.
Okay, before we get into that, I have a question. How did Tubman actually find the people she was rescuing? I mean, secrecy was so important.
That's a great question, and we'll get into the answer right after this.
So before the break, we were talking about how Tubman found people to rescue on the Underground Railroad. With all the secrecy involved, it seems like it would have been so difficult.
Right, it was all about that network. You know, the connections she had made through family and friends and her church community, she used that web of trust to get the word out and make plans.
It's like this whole secret communication system going on. But how did she actually connect with people on the ground, with the risk of getting caught being so high?
Well, she used that owl call we talked
Yeah.
about. Think about it. Hoot owls were everywhere in that area, so it wouldn't have seemed weird to anyone. Most likely, she used the call to just signal she was nearby.
But how would people know what that meant? Was there some kind of like code book about owl calls?
Probably not. It was more like she was just saying, hey, I'm around, and then they would have already agreed on a place to meet.
Okay, so it's about being subtle.
Exactly, and strategic.
What about meeting in cemeteries? That still seems so spooky, but also smart.
Yeah, it was the perfect cover. Black people could gather there and no one would think twice. People would think you were mourning, not planning an escape.
Tubman was so clever.
She was.
And just thinking about those journeys is scary.
They must have been terrifying.
The ranger who tried to recreate those journeys, walking through those same places at night and in the winter, she said it was really hard even without worrying about being caught.
I can imagine.
It really makes you think about the strength of those who escaped.
Absolutely. And then you've got Tubman entering the Civil War. It's like a whole new chapter of amazing things.
Right.
The ranger talked about how she went from the Underground Railroad to working for the Union Army. She was a nurse and a cook and a spy and a scout.
It's kind of amazing how the skills she learned on the Underground Railroad were perfect for the war.
It is like intelligence gathering and being able to navigate and even cooking for large groups.
Yeah, it all came in handy.
It really did. And then there's that incredible story of the Combahee River Raid. This is where we see Tubman as a real military leader.
Okay, tell me about this raid.
So picture it. June 1st, 1863, Tubman, along with Colonel James Montgomery and a group of black soldiers, they set off on 3 steam-powered gunships. They're heading up the Combahee River in South Carolina.
Sounds intense. What was their mission?
It was a 3-part mission: rescue enslaved people, recruit black men for the Union Army, and disrupt Confederate supply lines.
Wow, a lot to do.
It was a bold and dangerous mission.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, and Tubman, using all her experience gathering intelligence, she was crucial to the success of the mission.
How so?
She found out about Confederate mines in the river, so the Union ships were able to avoid those deadly traps and successfully carry out the raid.
So her intelligence work literally saved lives.
It did.
Did the mission achieve its other goals?
Yes, it was a huge success. They freed over 700 enslaved people that day. The ranger described this scene of a woman running towards the Union ships. She's got a pot of rice still steaming on her head. and her children are running behind her.
Wow, that image is powerful. It really shows the impact of what Tubman was doing.
Exactly. She wasn't just leading a mission, she was changing lives.
It's incredible. And the crazy thing is she never really got the recognition or the payment she deserved.
I know, after all that she did.
She spent years trying to get a pension for her work during the war.
It's unbelievable that she had to fight for that basic compensation.
It shows how much inequality there was at the time.
It does. Even after emancipation, Black people, especially Black women, had to fight for recognition and fair treatment.
It's amazing that she never gave up.
She was incredibly strong and determined.
So she escaped slavery, risked her life to help others escape, played a key role in the Civil War, and then had to fight for basic recognition.
It's an incredible story.
It really is.
And that strength stayed with her after the war. Remember how she always wanted to care for her aging parents?
Right.
That same compassion is what drove her to help her community.
It sounds like wanting to care for others was always important to her.
It was. She provided food, clothing, shelter, and support to anyone who needed it. It was like an extension of her work on the Underground Railroad, building a place of safety for people who had escaped slavery but were still facing challenges.
It's a good reminder that freedom doesn't mean the fight is over.
It does.
There's always more to do to help people who have been marginalized.
Exactly. And Tubman was all about that. She eventually opened a home for elderly African Americans right next to her own home.
Oh, wow. So she actually achieved her dream of opening that home.
She did.
That's such a beautiful legacy,
Yeah.
creating a place of care and dignity for people who had been through so much.
It really shows her character and her commitment to making the world better.
It's really inspiring. Hearing about Tubman's life and everything she did, it really shows you the power one person can have.
And the Ranger's personal connection to Tubman makes it even more meaningful. Remember how she talked about feeling Tubman's presence in the landscape, like in the rustling leaves or the call of a bird? It's like Tubman's spirit is still there in those places.
It's beautiful. And it reminds me of that question the ranger asked about what places or activities make you feel connected to history.
That's a good question to think about.
It is.
It makes you think of history as more than just facts and dates. It's like a living thing that's part of our lives.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Harriet Tubman's life, leaving you with that question to think about. Thanks for joining us on this journey. You know, that question about connecting to history, it really got me thinking about those times when the past just feels so real, like you could almost reach out and touch it.
Yeah, it is a powerful feeling. It shows how important it is to go beyond just the textbook version of history and look for those personal connections that bring the past alive.
Definitely. And I think in exploring Harriet Tubman's life, we've done that. We've gone beyond just the image of Moses leading people to freedom and really dug into all the complexities of her life.
Yeah, it has been a journey. From escaping slavery to her role in the Civil War and her constant commitment to helping others, Tubman's life is really inspiring.
It is. And the Ranger's insights and her own connection to Tubman's story, it's added so much. I loved what she said about a 5-foot-tall African-American woman from Dorchester County changing the world. It reminds us that we can all make a difference.
Yeah, no matter who we are or where we come from, it's a really important message, especially when things in the world feel so overwhelming. Tubman's story shows us that even small acts of courage and kindness matter.
Right. It's not always about big actions or huge victories. Sometimes it's just about being kind and doing what's right.
Exactly. And remember how Tubman would open her home to anyone who needed help?
Yeah.
It shows how much she cared about people.
And that's a powerful legacy.
It is.
And it ties in perfectly with her work later on when she opened that home for elderly African Americans.
Right.
It shows her dedication to creating a better world.
It all goes back to that idea of the landscape shaping Tubman. She took the strength she learned from the land and used it to help others, creating a place of safety and respect for people who deserved it.
It's a fitting ending to an amazing life. And to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one last thought from the Ranger. She talked about feeling Tubman's presence everywhere, in the rustling leaves, the call of a bird, just in the landscape itself.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's like her spirit is still there.
And it reminds us that history is all around us. So as you go about your day, pay attention to those moments when the past feels close. When you feel connected to something bigger than yourself, you might just find your own Harriet Tubman moment. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.